bienvenue, welcome.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to the Weimar Republic, a rather short-lived chapter in German history. Lasting from 1918 to 1933, this was a period of extremes, a direct consequence of the horrors of World War I. From sexual freedom and frivolity in cabaret clubs to rising tensions and extremist ideologies, the interwar period in the Weimar Republic was a curious time for the development of artistic expression and social revolution. Movements such as Dadaism and Expressionism, which captured the zeitgeist of the German society of that time, explain why this period remains a source of fascination for many people. In the post-Zwanziger, social changes were picked up on quite early by the artistic crowd, who channeled their dissatisfaction, fear, fascination, and awe during this period into art. Many artists coped with societal turmoil by indulging in hedonism and complete carelessness. Others decided to take a more active role in the societal changes, expressing their beliefs through avant-garde artistry. No matter their choice, they left an indelible mark on German history and global art, which lasting influence even today. Why was the Weimar Republic such a fertile ground for social and artistic movements? And how did such a big bastion of artistic freedom and social liberation become home to one of the most oppressive regimes in human history? Here to find out are Lena, Nicola, and Alice, students of history particularly interested in the history of art and social history. Together, we will try to find out the answer to the following question: what made the Weimar Republic so special?
It all began in 1918. The place, Forest of Compiègne. The time, 11 November. Germany has just surrendered after 5 long years of war at an unprecedented scale. Both sides have signed an armistice in Ferdinand Foch's railway carriage, situated just around 80 kilometers north of Paris. This monumental date, celebrated to this day, created the backdrop for the creation of the Weimar Republic. Less than 1 year later, in August 1919, the First Republic was officially formed after a revolution and a coup against the Kaiser Wilhelm II, bearing the name of the Republic of Weimar. It is set to last 14 years, 4 months and 14 days. In the first chapter of the Republican history of Germany, the horrors of the First World War still haunted the German public. Such widespread violence and annihilation had never occurred in modern European history. And what made it even worse for Germans was being the perpetrator and also the big loser of the war. Strong conflictual feelings occupied the minds of the German nation. Such a profound effect on an entire nation surely impacted the artistic and societal climate in society. Wide-reaching effects such as extreme poverty, international shame and distrust, and various other factors consequently had an effect on the shift in the German artistic field. Artistry was simultaneously used to share a vision of first-hand experience of the novel phenomenon of large-scale violence, but also to denounce the responsibility of political elites in the massacre of millions of soldiers, and eventually to express the complete disorientation caused by a shift in human and social relations. And among the most influential contributors arose Otto Dix. The artist was a major figure in the Expressionist movement, if not the most productive painter of the epoch. Formerly a soldier in the war, he pictures the horrors he witnessed by giving them a quirky aspect. After that, he kept interpreting the absurdity of his surroundings. The Squad Players shows how, after Germany's defeat in the First World War, day-to-day life turned into a grotesque display of mutilated, shell-shocked and depraved members of society. The satirical brush of Dix in this picture represents war as a gamble, a squat between the crippled and deformed soldiers, expressing the new reality of the total war and its devastating consequences on the survival of a country. Without a purpose or place in life, viewed only as a token of the German defeat, the only thing left for the veterans is playing cards and passing time with fellow soldiers. Their dehumanization is portrayed through their deaf, blind, burnt, and crippled faces. Otto Dix also joined for a time the movement of Dadaism, though he was not the precursor of it. The originality of the movement remains in its political activism. It found itself included in social upheaval and to the communist Spartakists, which accompanied in the German capital the end of hostilities, and their plastic art piece, strongly subversive, accompanied the cruel image of this bourgeois dusk. Dadaism constructed itself to counter expressionism, meaningless and bloodless abstraction. How is it useful to denounce irregularities of society when the whole world is constructed on irrationality and inanity? The most important contributor to Dadaism in Berlin could be Raoul Haussmann. ABCD is one of Haussmann's paintings which takes an ironic and humoristic step towards its time. This painting also highlights the absurd nature of this movement, as the image is excessively dislocated by several sources and gives several axes of understanding, but none of coherence. Finally, the last main artistic movement which influenced the German artistic field is Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity. Art represented a form of escapism and relief for many, who found themselves trapped by extreme poverty, unhappiness, and the hyperinflation, which led to skyrocketing prices on essential goods, making life ever more bitter and unequal. The Neue Sachlichkeit artists embraced realism against abstraction. They combined their realism with a dose of the protest of the Dada movement. For the most part, their realism was not a traditional reflection of the world, in the traditional realist sense of the way, but a distorted and dark realism that aimed to expose the moral degradation in German history. Brutality, clarity that hurts. There's enough music to fall asleep to. Paint as fast as you can. Capture time as it races by, proclaimed George Grosz, one of the key actors of the movement along with Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, Christian Schad, and August Sander. Together, these artists addressed the corruption oozing from the contemporary ills of the Weimar Republic. They used satire, caricature, and surrealism. They depicted the actors of society. From bureaucrats, politicians to prostitutes and beggars, no one spared by their vengeful brush. Writer Raoul Haussmann defined Neue Sachlichkeit as satirical hyperrealism, as artists were concerned with depicting reality in the most crude manner possible. Often focused on individuals, portraiture was really common, and there is usually a tension present in the depiction of the individual between its representation and the role that person exercised in society. In the effort to truthfully represent the individual, Neue Sachlichkeit portraits show unflattering details or psychological distress.
The context of this tremendous creative period finds its roots in the highly political implication of artists. Many were convinced, especially by the future of socialism. In the journal Der Anbruch, the painter Ludwig Meidner proclaimed that socialism must be our new creed, through artistic content of expressionism, new objectivity, and Dadaism. But one event particularly jostled the political creative sphere, the Spartacist Revolution of 1919. The communist upheaval was closely linked to artistic creation, and some were highly inspired in their works, but it also divided artists among the left. The keenly felt failure of the revolution, as it was tanked by the Republican police, brought some to turn towards a resigned pragmatism, while some others remained fascinated by Bolshevism. Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht. Symbols of the broken-down revolution, symbols of disenchanted hopes. Der lebendige Portfolio von Anton Redescheidt gives a last tribute to these historical figures, showing the ambiguous visual iconography of martyrdom, redemption, and resurrection, as the carrier of justice, freedom, and love of humanity will eternally succeed one another. Contrasting with the omnipresence of leisure, of celebration up to thrill and lust, was the omnipresent poverty and inequality caused by the Depression. Weimar is fascinating for its ability to make misery, blood, and rupture coexist. The new flu is here, and it is not Spanish, but English in origin, and it is known as the new popular dance. In Berlin, foxtrot steps are applied to any old melody. Outside, they are banging away at the palace. Machine gun fire rattles around the advertising pillars, whose colorful posters bear invitations to foxtrot teas.
The crisis that racked Germany during the years immediately after the First World War probably promoted rather than stifled the growth of entertainment. There was a sizable increase in demand for amusement during this period. However overblown the contemporary talk of an amusement addiction may have been, it was not wholly imaginary. In part, this surge in demand may have reflected, as some have suggested, a desire to make up for lost time after years of wartime austerity. But by and large, it was due to the soaring inflation of the mark. As money lost its value, the virtue of saving gave way to the logic of spending it before it was worthless.
Artists of the avant-garde perpetually attempted to denounce this disconnection, this assumed neglection of misery. The November Gruppe was closely linked to the Marxist movements. It was created right after the German Revolution of 1918, and artists within it attributed themselves a specific role on the interpretation of events such as the Spartacist upheaval. The orator by Magnus Zeller, painted in 1919, suggests a subjective experience in the revolutionary dimension, through the transmission of emotion rather than of context of speech and ideas. The orator represents both the agitator and the Messiah as carrying of the redeeming word, a world in which socialism could fully structure society and government. A world in which pariahs of societies, prostitutes, beggars, alcoholics, thieves, could emerge from shadow and join the public sphere.
Mit meiner Schwester ist nichts zu machen. Die ist
Emancipation and freedom, or decadence and poverty, the debate may hold. However, this freeing of sexuality also contributed to a newfound independence for women. Similarly as in other countries involved in the Great War, women increasingly worked in the fields and in the war production during the war, because the young men who used to constitute the workforce were on the battlefields. The Weimar Constitution of 1919 promised women legal and economic equality with men. This mentality was applied to a society where women were conceived by the Emperor Wilhelm II himself as having a role in Kirche, Kirche und Kinder, or church, kitchen and children only. As Claudia Kunz put it, the Weimar leaders grafted a democratic state onto a traditionalist and conservative social structure and thoroughly capitalist economy. However, it was enough to spark up a rebellious wave amidst many women, specifically as women fought against the criminalization of abortion and contraception, as an article written in 1921 by the SFB, Syndicalist Women's Union, states that the advancement in the intellectual development of women could not be possible without the liberation from the slavery of childbearing. The Great War triggered a sudden, stronger interest for American culture, and specifically for cinema and its movie stars, harboring the fashion of the time. A sexually active, independent woman, what a truly enticing thought, which, although very attractive, hides the exploitation and hopelessness. The new face of women is embodied by Christian Schad's painting Sonia, the face of a woman who almost resembles a man, with her short hair and habit of smoking, the face of the independent woman. The new women are also a sexual attraction. They go to the cinema in the evenings, wear skirts that end above the knees, buy Elegant World and the film magazines, as described the magazine Das Tagebuch. Cabaret culture brings up whiffs of cigarette smokes and embalming perfume, jazz music and the sound of pearl necklaces twirling around the bare necks of dancers, as can be seen in the film Cabaret. Beautiful, independent women were shown in magazines and movies at the time, and so began the cult of opulence. As inflation, unemployment and homelessness were burgeoning, many women attempted to make a name for themselves, harboring expensive fur coats and silk dresses. The dichotomy between between opulence and decadence is depicted by Otto Dix in his painting Großstadt, as the warm atmosphere of a jazz club is contrasted with beggars on one side and prostitutes on the other. The novel Das Kunstseidene Mädchen by Irmgard Köhn portrays a woman who earns her own money, lives at the expense of various men and buys expensive clothes regularly. As she moves to Berlin to become a movie star, she falls prey to the streets and becomes a prostitute, which illustrates the hidden demon behind the sexual emancipation, the exploitation of poor women who often finished in the streets. The idea of a new woman therefore reveals itself to be another trap made by the male eye, transforming women into sexual objects and throwing them into the streets. Just as the censors stumbled, publishers and artists who were inspired by their sense of a new era of freedom rushed to produce a wide array of media that dealt with gender and sexuality, from nude modern dance to new magazines for gay men. And in fact, in the 1930 film Morocco, a tuxedo-clad Dietrich in the role of Amy Jolly gave cinema one of its first on-screen lesbian kisses, securing her status in the LGBTQ+ icon. Weimar was one of the first periods of the 20th century in which queers were accepted to some extent. Photos from the El Dorado Club show the omnipresence of travestites, gender fluidity, and various sexual orientations. Globally, these were years of sexual emancipation to many aspects, towards men and women, gays and lesbians, prostitutes and queers. Clubs were numerous in Berlin, and proved to be the core of lust, sexual desire, prostitution and seduction. In Babylon, Berlin, the Mocke FT is a cabaret in which most of the storyline takes place. This is where the main character, Charlotte, occasionally sells sex in the basement. When no customer requires her services, she amuses herself at the nightclub and dares to kiss another woman for the first time in public. Codes are overthrown, decency and etiquette don't matter in the middle of the night. The Mocke FT really existed, and although it looked more like a regular cafe, it was pure decadence inside. It is surprising how thin the line could be between prostitution and decent life in the 1920s Berlin. And in a TV series, we can see how easily customers glide between the restaurant part and the brothel, which has nothing especially clandestine about it. For film 2, a window of relative freedom opened in the early 1920s. The revolution abolished the Kaiserreich's practice of vetting films prior to their release, allowing for the premiere of what was most likely the world's first gay rights film. This film is Different from the Others, directed by Richard Oswald. Ander als die Andern tells the unhappy story of a talented violinist who ends up killing himself after being blackmailed. The film ends by calling for the repeal of the sodomy law, which restricted sexual liberties during the 20s. This film was highly contested by conservatives, as it was seen as a suggestion of a change of how Germans had sex, and for the worse. It was nevertheless undeniable that, although this film was censored at some point, its influence were far above the salle obscure.
Directly inspired from Different from the Others, Das Lila Lied, or the Lavender Song, was played in German cabaret from 1920. Written by Kurt Schwarbart and composed by Misha Spolensky, right after the first International Conference for Sexual Reform, which called for regulation on sexual behavior to be based on science instead of religion or other unscientific tradition, the song came to be considered as one of the first gay anthems. The first line referred to Different from the Others. Wir lieben nur die lila Nacht. We only love the lavender night, which is humid because we are different from the others. Its impact was in fact explained by the expansion of cinema, radio and mass culture in Weimar, Germany. A productive cinematic boom between 1918 and 1919 was the reason why cinema remained affordable after the hyperinflation, but it was also the result of cheap access. Although cinema was mainly attractive for the youth and the highest educated classes, the working class family could have access to the average quintup as well. The quintup could hardly have been more different than the formal cinema palace. Visitors often came and went at all time, regardless of advertised screening time, which led to constant problems of overfilling. If there were no seats available, the ale would suffice until someone left. People often brought along something to eat or drink, frequently smoked in spite of the strict prohibition against it, and happily chatted away, applauded and shouted their support for the hero on the screen. Though the films themselves were silent, the cinemas were certainly not. The rapid pace of change in the society and the immense trauma from World War I also led people to focus more on their inward lives, on spirituality and psychology. Authors like Hermann Hesse, a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, pioneered the modern spiritual and reflective novel, with works such as Siddhartha and Steppenwolf, diving deep into the psychological dimension of human existence. Hesse also made a great contribution with his novel Demion, but other famous examples include The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. While these coming-of-age novels have existed for quite some time before the 20th century, it is in the period of the Weimar Republic that they would gain extreme popularity. This fascinating emergence of the Bildungsroman genre could be explained as a consequence of the Great War. Shocked by the violent nature of the war, the European nations had felt as if they had been living in a terrible nightmare for 5 long years. Life had become purposeless and without meaning. One day you could have it, another you could be dead. This surely had a major psychological impact on the individual, especially on the soldiers and civilians on the front lines. It could then be said that the large interest in the functioning of the mind, in the purpose of life and meaning in general, were consequences of this major event. Humanity wanted to learn from its past mistakes, move forward and create a better future, a better tomorrow.
But soon says a whisper, arise, arise, tomorrow belongs to me. Oh, Father and Father.
Sadly, this huge social progress was followed side by side with much grimmer processes in the society. Rising nationalism and antagonism in the Republic led to fewer and fewer artists expressing their sentiments about the society freely, instead opting to leave the country and continue their artistic work from outside of the German borders. One such example is the Bauhaus. The most historically famous art school, created in 1919, was known for its approach to design, which corresponded to the vision of artists of the avant-garde, such as Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, and others. It had eventually a substantial impact on the development of architecture, industrial design, graphic design, until it closed under pressure from the Nazi regime, being too close to the Communist Party. However, its influence remained untouched, as the staff kept painting and spreading its idealistic precepts all around the world after fleeing Germany.
Oh, I understand your objection. I grant you the problem's not small. But if you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all.
While for some this period represented the breaking of boundaries and unprecedented freedom, others were not so lucky. The antagonism towards Jews was getting increasingly present in German society, and it would only get worse. In the early 1930s, Weimar Germany had just lived through soaring inflation, the likes of which had never been seen before. Naturally, the nation was looking for someone to blame, and at the same time politicians were looking for a scapegoat, and they had found the perfect one: Jews. Generally more affluent than the rest of society, the Jewish community was an easy target for the increasingly nationalistic and extremist tendencies within society. Coupled with their history of always being the outsiders, they presented an ideal group to both profit from and blame. Strong anti-Semitism has always been present throughout Europe, specifically in Russia and Romania, during the period of the pogroms, which explains why many Jews initially fled to Germany. Since 1871, They had been equal before the law to other citizens, which enabled them to become successful during the Weimar period, specifically in arts, the press, law and medicine, although they didn't dominate the German economy as the anti-Semitism narrative charged them to. This dormant anti-Semitism, or at least less obvious, violently rose up during the inflation period by impeding directly to the image of Jews through the use of cartoons published in the press and even children's stories. The most visually anti-Semitic newspaper was named Der Stürmer, published by Julius Streicher from 1923 to 1945. It depicted Jews through the use of caricatures, portraying fat people with big noses and often visioning pornography to depict Jews as the embodiment of sin. On the first page of all their newspapers and in all editions could be read, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, meaning the Jews are our misfortune.
Children's stories specifically targeted Jews. The Forest Jew, the Blood Jew, or the Wandering Jew are all examples of stories that German parents will tell their children in order to make sure they didn't come home late or go too far in the woods. Anti-Semitism was paired with the emergence of brutal nationalism because of the narrative of the us versus them, which was once again very present in the press.
Life is a cabaret, oh chum. Come to the cabaret. Come taste the wine. Come hear the band. Come blow your horn, start celebrating. Right this way, your table's waiting. What good's permitting some prophet of doom to wipe every smile away?
Despite the strong social movements arising in the country, the pure indifference of a large number of people too worried either about their survival or their hedonistic desires led to the rise of National Socialist German Workers' Party, aka the Nazi Party. While many could see the party as growing influence, especially on the youth who had not experienced the violence of World War I, rarely who perceived them as a threat. The 1972 film Cabaret, of which we already saw a few scenes, is based on a musical inspired by the book Goodbye to Berlin, written by Christopher Isherwood. This novel details the last day of the Weimar Republic and is a perfect example of the Nazi impact slowly creeping into the German consciousness. As he writes, the Nazis may write like schoolboys, but they are capable of anything. That's just why they're so dangerous. People laughed at them, right up to the last moment. The Germans thought that the Nazi Party members were a nuisance, a problem that would resolve itself in due time. However, they would be proven wrong. While the party did not have a big influence on politics in the first half of the 1920s, they increasingly gained more and more followers. People who were angry and frustrated with the state of post-war Germany and needed to express their dissatisfaction through often violent means. By 1931, they had become a public menace, infiltrating all layers of the society, attracting both young and old men and women. Artists, however, were not exactly fond of this change and wanted to express themselves. Writers like Heinrich Mann wrote extensively on the social issues of German society ever since the imperial period. He had recognized the fascist movement rather early, but his sharp, cunning sense of perception would, however, make him the enemy of the system. Fast forward a few years. It's 30 January 1933. Adolf Hitler has just become the German Chancellor. This event started a domino effect that would lead to the suffering and death of millions of innocent people, including many artists and activists. Heinrich Mann himself was forced to flee from the country, becoming a persona non grata in this new regime that did not care much for plurality of opinions. And while Hitler did care much about art, his taste was rather judgmental and selective, setting aside the new contemporary art as pure rubbish and a danger of society. Avant-garde artists and social commentators would be mocked and shamed through events like the Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937. From this moment onwards, only darker times will come. But it is undeniable that this period launched a chain of events that would influence artistic and social movements all around the globe. To this day, the Weimar Republic represents an era of unprecedented freedom of expression and the exploration of new territories, clashing with rising extremism and moral depravity. Such a volatile mixture was bound to explode at a certain point, unleashing World War II, a global war on the largest scale in the history of humankind. No doubt, then, that continuing to research this key period when it all began is crucial for the understanding of the world we live in today.